Mark Bennett never expected that a temporary visit to his grandfather's home would feel so quietly unsettling from the very beginning. The old house in the Willowbrook Hills neighborhood stood apart from its pristine neighbors, not because it was dilapidated, but because it remained unapologetically real. No vinyl fences, no artificial turf, no solar-paneled perfection. Just a weather-worn porch swing that creaked with every breeze and a flagpole that held a folded American flag encased in glass above the front mantel, surrounded by modest furniture and shelves of military memorabilia left untouched since the 1980s. It was the kind of house people remembered not for its aesthetics, but for the life it held inside, a sense of history that lingered like smoke. Mark, an architect in his late 20s with a quiet disposition and little patience for small talk, had always admired the house for its honesty. His grandfather, Ralph Bennett, a hard-of-hearing Korean War veteran with a stern jaw and an impeccable routine, had lived there alone for nearly 30 years since his wife passed. After a minor fall during his morning gardening routine, Ralph was recovering in a rehabilitation facility across town, and Mark had volunteered to house-sit and handle maintenance for the next few weeks. He told himself it would be a break from the city and a chance to design in peace. No deadlines, no meetings, just the sounds of birds and floorboards and the occasional storm. But peace was never what Willowbrook Hills offered. Not really. On his first day, Mark found a crisp envelope wedged beneath the front door with a printed HOA seal and his name typed neatly in black ink. Inside was a 3-page welcome guide, though guide was perhaps generous. It was a litany of regulations, instructions, and expectations, laced with phrases like visual cohesion, structural alignment, and communal integrity. One line, however, stood out in bold. Only one active occupant per household is permitted, without prior authorization. Mark raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure whether that was intended to apply to him or to his grandfather, who still legally owned the property. Either way, it felt invasive. He set the packet aside, brushing it off as bureaucratic fluff, and tried to focus on settling in. But subtle things began to feel off. Neighbors would pause their gardening when he stepped outside, nod stiffly, and then quickly look away. A woman, walking her dog, turned onto a different street when she saw him. No one offered a smile, a wave, or even the standard "welcome to the neighborhood" cliché. On the second evening, while unpacking old blankets from the attic for the guest room, Mark noticed something strange. The flag case in the living room, the one that Ralph always made a point of dusting every Sunday, had been slightly tilted on its stand, and there was a faint crack at the base of the glass that hadn't been there before. He crouched down and studied it, his fingers tracing the splinter in the frame. A ripple of unease passed through him. It wasn't broken, not completely, but it had been touched, and Ralph would never have left it that way. He fixed the angle and made a mental note to ask his grandfather about it on his next visit. The next morning, as he returned from a jog, he found Karen Lively, the HOA chair, standing on the edge of the front lawn, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the morning light. She greeted him without a smile. Her voice was neutral, polite to the point of condescension, as she explained that a few concerns had been raised about the property's appearance and occupancy status. "The community values clarity, Mr. Bennett," she said, eyeing the front porch as if it were hiding something offensive. "And your presence, while understandable, must be formalized. You'll find the proper paperwork in your mailbox by noon." She turned before he could respond and walked away, heels crunching against the gravel, as if her presence had simply been a formality. An opening move. Mark watched her leave, the tight knot in his chest slowly pulling tighter. It wasn't until he stepped back inside and noticed that the old military footlocker near the bookshelf had been moved that he realized someone had already been inside the house. It began with a silence that didn't belong in the house. Not the natural quiet of an old structure settled into its age, but an absence that followed Mark from room to room as if the very air had shifted in tone. The morning was damp, overcast, and windless. One of those slow Saturdays when the world seems to pause, waiting for something to break. Mark had left for a few hours to visit his grandfather at the rehab center and drop off a few groceries and toiletries. The visit itself had been calm, even pleasant. Ralph seemed sharper that morning, more talkative, his speech still slowed by medication but lucid. They discussed the house briefly. Ralph asked if the mailbox was still standing after last week's storm, and Mark laughed, telling him that of all things the ancient rusted mailbox was still proudly upright while every other lawn decoration on the street looked like it had come out of a catalog. Before he left, Mark made a mental note to finally repair the hinges on the screen door, which had started to whine. Then he drove home through streets that felt somehow more watchful than usual. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, arms full of produce and a newspaper still half wet from the errant drizzle. It took him a moment to realize what had changed. Something was cleaner. Not tidier, but cleaner in a manufactured artificial sense, like when hotel staff refold your clothes and you realize they've gone through your suitcase. The living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and bleach, subtle but out of place. Mark placed the bag on the kitchen counter and moved slowly through the house, scanning each room. At first, nothing looked different. But the silence, yes, it was still there. And then his foot bumped into something soft beneath the dining table, a trash bag. The bag was loosely tied, half full. Inside were shards of broken glass, folded paper towels blotched with brown-red stains, and the unmistakable mahogany corner of the flag display case, split diagonally, with the flag itself rolled and compressed into the bottom of the bag. Mark stood motionless for several seconds, staring into the plastic void until the heat of realization hit him all at once. Someone had smashed the case, cleaned up the mess, and disposed of it as if it were refuse. No note, no explanation, no apology. Just concealed wreckage. His hands shook as he reached in and gently lifted the fabric, careful not to smear it further. The flag had blood on it, not fresh but dried, brown at the edges. He felt nauseous. Before he could begin to process, the doorbell rang. He didn't remember walking to the front door, only opening it to find Karen Lively on the other side, still in her HOA polo and slacks, clipboard under arm, expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said brightly, as if they hadn't spoken less than 24 hours earlier. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Mark didn't answer. He stepped aside and motioned toward the interior, too stunned to consider the absurdity of the gesture. Karen entered like a guest invited to tea, her eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the windows. "We had a wellness concern filed this morning," she began, her tone somewhere between bureaucratic and patronizing. "There was a report of an odor coming from the property, possibly mold-related. I took the initiative to conduct a brief interior check while you were out. Nothing invasive, of course." He stared at her. "You broke into my house." "I used the key under the flower pot," she said without hesitation. "Standard protocol in some neighborhoods, and I was under the impression this community maintained that tradition for emergencies." Mark's mouth opened, then closed again. "You smashed my grandfather's flag case." "The one on the mantel." Karen's head tilted ever so slightly. "That old thing." She glanced toward the living room, then offered a half smile. "It was already cracked when I arrived. I suppose I must have brushed against it. I didn't want anyone to cut themselves. It looked unsanitary." Mark's voice dropped, cold and certain. "That was a burial flag. It was folded by a Marine at his friend's funeral. That friend was 19 when he died." Karen blinked, but her face held firm. "Mr. Bennett, with all due respect, this house is currently non-compliant on at least 4 community standards. The fence height exceeds regulation by 3 inches. The mailbox design was delisted 2 years ago. The porch swing is visibly weathered. And the occupancy arrangement here, 2 individuals for a single residential property under provisional oversight, requires declaration. If you'd like, we can formalize your presence, but the board will require inspection access in advance." He didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, he stepped forward, reached into the trash bag, and pulled out the broken wood of the case. Holding it between them like a mirror, he waited for her to flinch. She didn't. Her gaze stayed locked on his. "You don't understand what you've done," he said finally, voice hoarse. "You think this is about aesthetics and bylaws. This house was built before any of you lived here. That flag case has been here longer than you've been breathing HOA regulations." Karen pursed her lips and adjusted her clipboard. "Legacy is no excuse for disorder. We strive for a community that reflects consistency, harmony, and progress." "You mean control?" "I mean standards." They stood there, locked in something too quiet to be a fight, but far too intense to be casual. Finally, Karen turned to leave, stepping back onto the porch. "You'll find a correction order in your mailbox by Monday," she said over her shoulder, "and I'd advise that you begin compliance efforts immediately. Non-cooperation has consequences, Mr. Bennett." He watched her walk away, down the gravel path, past the bent mailbox she so clearly resented, and back into the landscape of sculpted yards and near-identical facades. When the silence returned, it wasn't empty. It was violated. Mark turned back into the house, the shards of memory now littered across a garbage bag in the dining room. The flag, once folded into a symbol of honor, now looked more like evidence of a crime. He took it upstairs, cleaned what he could with water and careful hands, and set it beneath his sketching lamp, flattened and still, as if waiting for some unknown ritual to make it whole again. Mark didn't sleep that night. He stayed in the living room well past 2 in the morning, seated in the chair across from the now empty mantel, listening to the wind press against the windows like it wanted to come inside. The silence had changed again. It no longer felt hollow but electric, tense, like something waiting to be triggered. The remnants of the flag case were still in the trash bag which now sat beside the chair, its contents partially visible. The broken wood had split down the grain, clean and irreversible. He had retrieved the flag, flattened it, and placed it in the guest bedroom on a spare table. It lay there like a wounded body, stripped of ceremony. At around 3, he finally moved, walking the house one last time before locking the doors twice and shutting the lights. It was almost sunrise when he closed his eyes. By mid-morning, he was awake again, groggy and irritated, the sleep he'd managed already lost to the ache in his neck and the mental replay of Karen's voice. He walked outside to grab the mail, instinctively looking both ways down the street, but it was empty. No joggers, no gardeners, no children riding bikes, just the white-collar uniformity of trimmed hedges and identically spaced driveways. His mailbox creaked as he opened it. Inside were 2 envelopes, a utility bill and a thick cream-colored packet bearing the HOA emblem. No return address, no stamps. They must have hand-delivered it before dawn. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he went back inside, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window as it percolated. There was movement across the street. The neighbor, an older man with thinning white hair who Mark had seen watering his garden the day before, was standing on his porch, watching him. Their eyes met briefly. The man gave the slightest nod, almost hesitant, and then disappeared back into the house, drawing the curtain behind him. Mark sat at the table and opened the packet. It was a formal citation, dressed in carefully legal language listing a series of non-compliance infractions attributed to the Bennett residence. Among them, non-approved occupancy, unregistered dual habitation, visual deterioration of publicly facing structures, and suspicion of unsecured interior environment. Each point was accompanied by a dated observation, almost all of them aligned with the morning of Karen's intrusion. At the bottom, in bold, was a demand. Corrective measures must commence within 72 hours to avoid escalation. There was also a request for access approval for continued observation, along with a form marked Voluntary Neighborhood Harmony Pledge. He stared at the paper for several minutes, then folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it under the kitchen sink beside the spare dish soap. That afternoon, he drove to the rehab center to speak with Ralph. The old man was in the physical therapy room, moving his shoulder in slow, circular patterns under the guidance of a nurse who looked all of 23 and completely overwhelmed. When Mark entered, Ralph's eyes lit up slightly, though his expression remained stern. Mark waited until the nurse walked away, then sat beside him. "She broke the case," Mark said quietly. Ralph blinked. "Who?" "Karen, the HOA chairwoman. She said she was checking the house for mold or something. She used the flower pot key." Ralph exhaled through his nose. "It's not mold she's worried about." "I figured." Ralph leaned forward slowly, stretching his shoulder. "They've wanted that property compliant since the day your grandmother died. She kept them away for years, but after she passed, they started circling. I ignored them. They fined me. I ignored that, too. But I always thought they'd get tired." "They didn't," Mark replied. "They waited." Ralph turned to him. "If they can't control the house, they'll control the perception of it. You need to watch how they frame you. You're not a person to them." "You're a deviation." Mark nodded, biting back frustration. "There's a hearing next week," he said. "Some kind of review. If I don't respond to the citation, they escalate." "Let them escalate," Ralph said quietly, "but don't sign anything. Nothing that says you accept their narrative." The next 2 days passed like a slow tightening of the vise. Mark noticed subtle changes around the neighborhood. A car parked just a little too long across the street, someone photographing the house from the corner, a package marked "Return to Sender" that he hadn't ordered. On the second morning, the fence had a new sign posted, white with blue trim, stamped with the HOA emblem, Community Beautification Notice. Property under review. He hadn't seen anyone put it there. He removed it without ceremony and tossed it in the garage. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Mark heard a knock on the door. It was not a polite knock. It was short, authoritative. He opened the door to find 2 people standing there, both dressed in HOA polos, name tags clipped, one holding a clipboard, the other a narrow camera. The taller of the 2 spoke first. "Mr. Bennett, we're conducting a visual inspection pursuant to the review request filed earlier this week. You should have received notice." "I received a packet of accusations," Mark said. "And no, I didn't approve any inspection." "Well," the man continued, glancing toward the camera, "this is a courtesy survey. It's best we proceed with visual confirmation before it escalates to fines." Mark stepped out, letting the door close behind him. "You're not coming in." "We have rights of access to external structures." "That's not what you said. You said visual confirmation. You can confirm from the sidewalk." The woman with the camera raised it subtly and snapped a shot of the porch. Mark didn't move. His jaw locked. "You know this is only going to get harder if you're uncooperative," the man said. "We're trying to protect the aesthetic of the neighborhood." Mark's voice was low. "This neighborhood was built on individuality. Now you treat it like a showroom. You're not protecting anything. You're manufacturing sameness." The man shrugged, writing something on the clipboard. "Final notice will be issued in 48 hours." Mark turned and walked back inside without another word. He didn't slam the door, but the weight of it echoed through the walls. That night he lay awake again, the quiet now sharper, no longer just tense but watchful, predatory. He dreamed of the flag floating in still water, unfolding endlessly with no center, no completion. In the morning, the front porch was covered in white powder. Flour, strewn deliberately in a clear circle around the welcome mat. A small gesture, maybe. But Mark understood what it meant. They wanted him to feel watched. They wanted him to question his own movements. They wanted him to break. By the 5th day, Mark had stopped looking for peace. He knew it wouldn't come while the front of the house remained under scrutiny, while every walk to the mailbox felt like walking across a stage. The porch had been cleaned, of course. He'd swept the flour into a pan and dumped it into the compost, resisting the urge to analyze it for fingerprints or DNA, knowing full well it was meant to provoke, not harm. But the message lingered. It always did. The air had grown dense with the kind of tension that doesn't explode. It metastasizes, slowly saturating every corner of your thoughts until even silence feels weaponized. Every creak of the floorboards at night sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of tree branches outside became a potential observer. Paranoia had never been a familiar emotion for Mark, but now it was beginning to seem like the only appropriate response. The correction deadline arrived the following morning in the form of a heavy envelope left on the porch, centered neatly on the doormat as if hand-measured. Inside was a formal notice of violation, accompanied by a new list of increasing concerns. The accusations had grown more abstract, almost poetic. Visual inconsistency with neighborhood tonality, unverified familial occupancy alignment, and, most absurd of all, elevated potential for disharmonious domestic presence. There were no instructions, just implications and veiled threats. On the final page was a date. 1 week from today, a mandatory mediation meeting with the HOA board. If he failed to appear, it would be considered an admission of non-compliance, and further steps would be taken. Mark spent the afternoon digging through the drawers in his grandfather's office. The room hadn't changed in over a decade. Thick wood desk, brass lamp with a broken hinge, folders stacked in dusty piles that leaned slightly like forgotten gravestones. He pulled everything out, moving carefully until he found what he was looking for. An old beige file folder labeled HOA, Initial Charter/Exemption. Inside were 3 yellowing sheets. One was a typed letter from the 1980s confirming that the Bennett property, built in 1951, had been grandfathered out of the original HOA incorporation due to its historic designation. The second was a signed waiver by the original HOA board president, declaring that the Bennett lot was exempt from all mandatory aesthetic regulations. The third was a map, hand-drawn but clear, outlining the boundary lines of the HOA's jurisdiction, with the Bennett property explicitly marked excluded. Mark stared at the documents for a long moment. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was erasure. He scanned them, made copies, and placed the originals in a lockbox. Then, for the first time since arriving, he walked to a neighbor's house, Mrs. Donner, the widow who lived 2 doors down, known in the community for her reclusive habits and an immaculately pruned garden of dead flowers. She answered the door with visible hesitation, opening it only halfway. Her expression shifted when she saw what he held. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, holding up the file. "But I think you might know something about this." She stared at him for a long moment before finally stepping back. "Come in, but be quick." Inside, her home smelled faintly of lavender and age. The walls were covered in framed photos, none recent. Mark handed her the papers and watched her eyes widen as she read. "I remember this," she whispered, pointing to the map. "They made a deal with your grandfather and 2 others back when the development started pushing in. They didn't want to join. Your grandfather said he wouldn't live in a painted cage. He never mentioned any of this to me," Mark said. "But the current HOA says we're under their authority now." Mrs. Donner shook her head. "That's what they do. They revise, they rewrite, they rezone. Most of the people here have only lived in this neighborhood for the last 10 years. They've never seen that map. They don't care about the exceptions. They only care about eliminating the deviations." Mark left her house with more than just validation. He left with a photocopy of a neighborhood newsletter from 1985 in which the Bennett house was explicitly listed as non-governed property by mutual agreement. It wasn't legal precedent, but it was history. And in a community obsessed with rules, history had power. The week passed in stages. Every day brought a new gesture from the HOA, some obvious like the removal of his garbage cans before pickup day, resulting in a missed collection and a notice for property hygiene delay, and others more subtle, like the broken sprinkler head in the front yard that left a slow leak running into the street. The camera cars returned, more frequently now, parking for longer stretches and capturing angles that made no sense unless you were cataloging behavior, not structure. On the morning of the mediation, Mark dressed plainly, black shirt, dark jeans, neutral sneakers, and walked the 5 blocks to the HOA building located inside the community clubhouse, a sterile structure flanked by hedges trimmed like puzzle pieces. Inside, everything was too clean. The floors gleamed with an unnatural sheen, and the walls were painted in the HOA's signature blue-gray tone that seemed to suck the color out of your skin. The meeting room was long, with one table at each end and folding chairs aligned like a deposition. Karen sat at the far end, flanked by 2 board members, both wearing matching blazers and identical expressions of professional emptiness. A man named Colin, who introduced himself as the board's compliance mediator, sat in the center. He gestured for Mark to sit, smiled like a dentist about to begin a root canal, and opened a binder. "Let's begin," he said. "The purpose of this meeting is not punitive. It's restorative. We want to establish harmony, mutual understanding, and productive coexistence." Mark said nothing. He placed the exemption documents on the table and slid them forward. Karen didn't flinch. Colin took them, leafed through them with mild interest, then looked up. "These are compelling. However, we'll need to verify authenticity. The HOA's current charter supersedes all historical exceptions unless legally reinforced. Were these recorded officially with the county?" "No," Mark said evenly, "because at the time, the HOA wasn't recognized as a formal municipal authority. It was a private organization with volunteer oversight, which means this document is the only agreement that existed." Karen leaned forward slightly. "We've reviewed the property records. There's no current exemption on file. That makes the structure subject to jurisdiction." Mark looked at her, his voice firm. "So, what you're saying is, you deleted it." "No," she said calmly. "We simply updated the system." Colin cleared his throat. "This can be resolved. If you're willing to sign a provisional compliance agreement, we can phase in regulations over a 12-month period. Aesthetic changes, updated fencing, and removal of unauthorized displays." "You mean the flag?" Mark interrupted. There was a pause. Karen's mouth tightened. "We simply mean the broken display that no longer meets safety standards," she said. Mark stood slowly. That flag was folded at a funeral. That display held memories. You broke it, you covered it up, and now you want to fine me for not pretending it never mattered. Colin opened his mouth, but Mark didn't let him speak. "You don't get to erase people just because they make your street look less like a brochure. You don't get to redefine someone's life into a line item. My grandfather built that house. He earned his quiet. And you've declared war on it for not being symmetrical enough." Karen stood as well. "Mr. Bennett, if you refuse to engage in productive discourse, this matter will escalate." Mark nodded. "Let it." He left the meeting room without another word, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a warning. Behind him, no one called out. No one followed. And outside, the sky had finally started to darken with rain. It didn't fall, not yet, but it waited, ready, still, quiet. Just like him. The rain arrived the next morning, slow and deliberate, soaking into the cracks of the walkway like ink bleeding through paper. Mark stood at the window watching it for a long time, arms crossed, one hand absently clutching the worn cord of the blinds. It wasn't the weather that unsettled him. It was the stillness beneath it. No cars passed, no joggers braved the mist, not even the neighbor's dog barked. The neighborhood felt paused, like a painting, its vibrancy drained by something invisible and calculated. The mediation hadn't stopped the HOA's momentum. It had sharpened it. By midday, the first new violation notice was taped to the front door, sealed in a waterproof sleeve and printed on heavier paper than before, as if weight could translate into authority. It accused Mark of deliberate resistance to communal reintegration, failure to observe regulatory collaboration protocols, and, most ominously, suspected ideological interference with governance. He read the words twice, mouth half open. It was absurd, language lifted from bureaucratic fiction, but it came with consequences. The bottom line stated that a fine of $1,750 would be imposed within 5 business days unless a formal agreement was signed. Mark didn't even bother pulling the notice down. He let it hang there, wet and solemn. Like a flag, no one saluted. Then the back gate disappeared. It wasn't broken or vandalized, just gone. The frame still stood, but the wood panels had been removed, hinges unscrewed cleanly and carried off. Mark discovered the absence by accident, stepping out to check on the garden only to find an open void where the entrance to the alley had been. No footprints, no damage, just clean removal. He walked the alley twice looking for discarded wood or signs of movement, but there was nothing. That same afternoon, a representative from the HOA's new Safety Committee arrived with a clipboard and a warning smile, claiming the gate was likely in violation and had been removed for review. When Mark asked who had entered the property, the HOA, man simply gestured toward the community charter stapled to the back of his form. Security adjustments fall under our extended oversight, he said, as if reciting from memory. It's standard during periods of transitional friction. The phrase stuck in Mark's head for hours. Transitional friction. As if the destruction of someone's home could be reframed as a design challenge. That night, Mark placed a small chair beside the flag, now refolded and resting on the desk upstairs, and sat quietly with a sketch pad on his lap, pretending to work. His pencil never moved. At 2 a.m., he heard movement outside, faint but deliberate. He rose without a sound and moved to the porch. Rain still fell, lighter now, mist curling through the hedges. Down the street, a pair of silhouettes moved near a lamppost, 2 people standing just outside the perimeter of the Bennett property. He couldn't see their faces, but one of them held what looked like a camera. They weren't photographing the house. They were photographing him. When he stepped forward onto the wet porch, the figures turned and disappeared into the dark. The next morning, the mailbox had been uprooted. Not destroyed, again, cleanly removed. A temporary HOA box had been installed in its place, bolted into the sidewalk, bearing the phrase, Centralized Communication Point. Mark stared at it for a long time, then walked back into the house and slammed the door so hard it rattled the hallway mirror. By now, he understood the pattern. They didn't break things to cause chaos. They extracted them surgically, erasing bits of autonomy like termites hollowing out a wall. When he checked his email, he found an automated message from the HOA digital portal. TU, subject line, compliance tracking status, yellow. The body of the message contained a pixelated map of the neighborhood, his property outlined in red, and a bar marked Deviation Score 72%. A list followed, each item increasingly surreal. Unsubstantiated historical resistance, failure to integrate into community social rhythms, non-participation in HOA culture. At the bottom was a note, systemic intervention pending. He forwarded the message to himself, printed it, and taped it to the fridge. If they wanted to turn his life into a data point, he would wear it like a badge. 2 nights later, someone left a package at the door. There was no label, no return address. Inside was a plastic-wrapped stack of faux wood siding samples, each labeled with color codes approved by the HOA. At the bottom was a sticky note in looping cursive. These tones would be more welcoming. He dropped the samples into the trash without a second thought. When he visited Ralph that afternoon, he didn't mention the latest escalation. The old man's face had grown drawn, his eyes distant as if preparing for a confrontation that he couldn't physically attend. Mark tried to keep the conversation light, talked about replacing the porch swing, planting a tree in the backyard, but Ralph saw through it. Before Mark left, Ralph took his hand and held it longer than usual. "Don't let them make you explain yourself," he said. "That's how they break you. They don't argue. They ask you to justify your existence until you forget it was ever valid." On the way home, Mark drove slower than usual. The neighborhood felt more artificial by the day. Every yard looked like it had been cloned from a catalog. Every home slightly too perfect, too still. He passed Karen walking a small white dog, its leash adorned with a red ribbon. She didn't look at him, but she stopped walking the moment his car passed, turning slowly toward the vehicle as if rehearsing a gaze for future testimony. Back at the house, he found a new sign on the front lawn. Bright blue. Reflective letters. Future site of Compliance Restoration Zone. It had been staked into the ground without consent, right at the edge of the walkway. Below the headline, smaller text read, "Neighborhood Model Property Initiative Pending Review." Mark stood in the rain staring at it, hands clenched, his teeth grinding so hard his jaw began to ache. Then he turned, walked inside, went to the garage, retrieved a hammer, and tore the sign out of the ground in 3 violent strikes, splinters flying like sparks. He carried the pieces to the alley and dumped them into the trash bin, then turned back to the house, soaked, panting, and cold. But it was worth it. Because it was the first thing in days that had felt like a decision made on his own terms. Mark didn't plan for the confrontation. He hadn't drawn up a strategy or rehearsed speeches or even decided how it would end. But when the HOA's final notice arrived, thick, embossed, and slipped under the door like a silent dare, something in him moved beyond resistance and into certainty. The document declared the property temporarily repossessed for community compliance pending resolution, citing an obscure clause from a 2006 amendment that no longer existed in the official charter. There was no hearing, no court order, just a signature line at the bottom and a date. Thursday, noon. An appointed time for what they called a formal reclaiming of visual stewardship. Mark read the sentence 5 times before letting the paper fall to the floor. He stood in the kitchen for nearly an hour without moving, as the hum of the refrigerator grew louder and louder until it sounded like static flooding the house. He didn't call anyone. He didn't warn Ralph or ask for help or post about it online. There would be no spectacle. He simply prepared. That morning, he opened every curtain in the house, every window, letting the breeze move through the rooms. He set the folded flag carefully back on the mantel, placed between 2 candles he'd found in a drawer, and dusted the frame where the glass had once been. The case had never been replaced. It remained cracked and raw, a visible scar of what had been done, and Mark wanted it to stay that way. He swept the porch, polished the old brass doorknob, and fixed the broken hinge on the screen door, the one Ralph had asked about on his first day here. By 11:30, the house looked like itself. Not restored or modernized or sanitized, but real. It looked like a place someone had fought to keep. The delegation arrived at 11:58. 3 vehicles parked with geometric precision at the edge of the curb. Karen stepped out first, followed by 2 board members in matching beige windbreakers and a new man Mark didn't recognize. A younger guy, maybe 30, wearing a tie beneath a corporate HOA lanyard, holding a thick binder that suggested legal weight, even if it didn't contain any. They approached the house without hesitation, Karen already halfway up the walk before Mark opened the door. "Mr. Bennett," she began, voice clipped, "we're here as scheduled. I'd like to remind you that this is a non-confrontational compliance execution. There's no need for escalation." Mark leaned on the doorframe. "You came to steal a house. Call it what it is." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't flinch. "The property is in systemic violation. You've refused corrective measures, failed to sign integration protocols, and actively dismantled HOA initiatives." "You're not the government," Mark said. "You don't own this land." The man with the binder stepped forward. "Sir, as per subsection." "Don't," Mark cut in. "Don't quote paper at me. Show me a deed. Show me a court order. Show me one legal signature from a judge that gives you the right to cross that threshold." There was a pause. Karen shifted her stance, then gestured to the board member on her right, who opened a thin metal case and produced a camera, clearly prepared to document the removal process. "We're authorized to proceed," she said. The community approved the resolution unanimously. Mark's face didn't move. "You mean the people too afraid to speak in public? You mean the votes cast under threat of fines? You mean the silence you cultivated like a garden?" Karen inhaled slowly, then stepped forward, raising her voice slightly. "Mr. Bennett, please vacate the doorway. You're impeding official proceedings." "No," he said calmly, and stepped fully into the frame, blocking the entrance. Behind him, the house stood still. No music, no electronics, just space and memory and presence. The broken flag case, the old furniture, the scratches in the floor from Ralph's walker, all of it visible, all of it intact. For the first time, Karen hesitated. She looked past him, into the living room, and her mouth tightened. The younger man reached for his phone. Then, a voice from the street. "Excuse me." They turned. Ralph Bennett stood by the curb, hands resting on a cane, eyes sharp. He wore his full uniform jacket, not a costume, but the real thing, still bearing faded patches, the fabric pressed as best as age and tremor allowed. He hadn't told Mark he was coming. Mark's chest tightened. The old man was thinner than before, his gait slower, but his presence struck the group like a warning. "I believe this house is still mine," Ralph said. Karen blinked. "Mr. Bennett, I was told—" "You were told I was done," Ralph interrupted. "That I was out of the way, that the house was yours to correct." Silence. Ralph began walking, slow but steady, his cane tapping the sidewalk like a metronome. "This flag," he said, nodding toward the mantel behind Mark, "was folded by a boy who died 20 feet from me. I brought it home to my wife. We kept it in this house longer than you've been alive. And you came in here. You broke it. You didn't ask. You didn't knock. You walked through my door like you'd been given permission by the wind." Karen said nothing. Ralph stepped onto the porch. "You don't scare me," he said quietly. "Not because you're harmless, but because you think harm is protocol." The younger man looked down at his phone. "Sir, we're going to need to—" "No, you won't," Ralph said. Karen's voice returned, quiet now. "We're acting under community consensus." "And I'm the community you erased from the record," he said. She didn't respond. Ralph turned to Mark. "Leave the door open," he said. "Let them see what's inside." And then, for the first time, the street wasn't empty. One by one, the neighbors emerged, quietly, hesitantly, drawn by the presence, by the uniform, by the breach of the spell that silence had held over them for years. Mrs. Donner stood across the street, her arms crossed. The man with the white hair leaned on his fence. No one shouted. No one intervened. But they watched. And for Karen, that was worse than resistance. It was exposure. She lowered her clipboard. The man with the camera turned it off. No one crossed the threshold. No one said another word. And slowly, one step at a time, they left. The neighborhood never returned to what it had been. Something in the air had shifted, not loudly, not with ceremony, but in that quiet way a door clicks shut behind you when you know you're not going back. The day after the confrontation, the sign was gone. No more blue reflective letters, no more notices or flags, no surveillance car idling at the corner. The centralized mailbox had been removed overnight, replaced, without announcement, by the original post, its crookedness now somehow dignified rather than offensive. No apology came, no formal withdrawal, just absence. And that, in its own way, was enough. Ralph stayed at the house for a few more days, reclaiming his space not with declarations but with small movements, watering the front garden himself, replacing the broken bulb on the porch light, sitting for hours in the living room without. Speaking. When he left again, this time by choice, it was only after he told Mark that the house would be signed over to him. No paperwork delay, no debate. You held the line, Ralph said simply. Now, build something with it. A month passed. Karen resigned from the board without ceremony, citing health prioritization and leadership fatigue. No one mentioned her again. Her house went up for sale soon after, and while the listing stayed vague, the whispers carried further than her reach ever had. The HOA revised its charter, quietly. A few phrases vanished from the language, and a new line appeared in the final page under a list of guiding principles. Personal memory shall not be subject to communal erasure. It meant nothing in legal terms, but it was the first honest sentence they'd ever written. And the house? It remained untouched. The cracked flag case stayed on the mantel, not repaired, preserved, because some things aren't meant to be restored, only remembered.